the analogy I've often used before, I don't mind using it again because I think it's absolutely right, is the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts, where the group of girls, as dramatized by Arthur Miller in The Crucible, but the group of girls, which was based on real, like this actually happened. These girls accused people of witchcraft, accused people of colluding with Satan. And whenever someone in the town said, "This is nonsense, the girls are making it up," the girls would then point at that person and say, "She's a witch," or "He's a witch," and then they would hang as well. So the risk was great. But that would have kept going and going and going. The only reason it stopped is because they reached a tipping point.
Hello and welcome to Recent UK. I'm Darren Grimes. Please do consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell if you enjoy today's show. And boy, oh boy, am I sure you absolutely will. Please consider as well supporting our GoFundMe page. The link to that's in the description if you're in a position to do so. So my guest today has a new book out next month on February 25th. Free Speech and Why It Matters will be published. Now, at a time when democratically elected presidents of the United States can be kicked off of social media platforms, when banks that used to provide loans to his businesses shut off access to their capital, and the new social media Twitter alternative Parler loses access to its host and platform via Amazon Web Services, you do start to realise that we'll have a problem when it comes to the toleration of dissent and opinion on the new public square. What is the new public square? Now, my guest argues that a new form of social justice activism, which perceives language as potentially violent, which has prompted a sort of national debate on where the limitations of acceptable speech should be drawn. I want to actually know, well, one, I want to know what's in the book. That would be a good start. But where should those parameters actually be drawn, and how do we actually go about doing it? So that guest is, of course, Andrew Doyle, the writer, comedian, and good friend of Twitter legend Titania McGrath. Hi, Andrew.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Now, Andrew, I dare say that 2020 provided rich pickings for writing a book on free speech. One, because of the lockdowns with sod all else to do in them, but that's a good time to write a book. And secondly, for the general craziness and insanity that 2020 inflicted upon the UK.
That's right. I was actually writing a book about the culture war, and then I've had to postpone that now because I started writing this book on free speech. But what I realised is actually this is a good way round to do it, because so much of the culture war and the social justice activism that I often write about is underpinned by this issue of free speech, and it's directly, intimately connected. So those who are advancing this very popular ideology now, very powerful ideology, at heart don't trust free speech, and they don't trust people to be able to speak their minds and for that not to cause utter chaos, because as you just mentioned, they believe in this intimate connection between power and language, one that is derived from the postmodern theorists, particularly the post-structuralist theorists of the 1960s, people like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jean-Francois Lyotard, people like that, and they believe that this connection exists. And actually a good way to explain it, I think, is the one you've mentioned, is the banning of Donald Trump. Because the banning of Donald Trump from Twitter and Facebook and all the other platforms, you'll have noticed that the traffic and the commentary about it ultimately seems to come down to whether the people like Trump or don't like Trump. So effectively, the people who hate Trump are cheering the fact that he's been banned, and the people who like Trump are obviously lamenting the fact that he's been banned. I am one who has been extremely critical of Trump. It would be very easy for me to use this and say, fantastic, I don't have to hear from him anymore. Unfortunately, the principle is much bigger than partisan politics, and it's even much bigger than Trump. But let's look at why Twitter banned him. Now, Twitter claim that the language that he used in his last two tweets was likely to incite violence. The two tweets in question, he was mentioning that he wasn't going to be attending the inauguration. And in the other tweet, he referred to that his followers would have a giant voice in the future. Now, by no standards is that incitement to violence at all. It's just not possible. In fact, you wouldn't find a lawyer or any sensible person in the
legal definition. Yeah.
There's absolutely no question of that. And it's not a controversial thing for me to say. By the legal standard, and you've got to remember the legal threshold for incitement is extremely high in America. I mean, it would have to meet what they call the Brandenburg test, which was established in 1969. And even in that case, it was a KKK rally. I mean, it was quite an extreme scenario. And the person in question was calling openly for vengeance. And even that didn't meet the benchmark for incitement. So it actually takes an awful lot, because of the constitutional protections for speech in America, because of the First Amendment. It takes an awful lot to have it to meet the legal threshold for incitement. There is absolutely no way in which Trump did so. So that's just a lie. The people who are not even a lie. I think it's a misunderstanding, actually. And I understand the strength of feeling behind it. I understand that people really despise Trump and think the things that he's done, and that is their right. And I do understand that emotional impulse when someone says something and is continually saying something that you hate and upsets you. The natural instinct is, oh, I wish they would just shut up. I wish they could just go away. And we all feel it. So I have complete sympathy for that position. However, we need to resist that impulse. Because the principle of free speech is so much bigger than that. And if you set that precedent that you can establish a scenario where the people that you don't agree with and you don't like can just be silenced, whether it's by the state or whether it's by big tech, who are, as you mentioned, obviously the proprietors of the de facto public square of the digital age. Well, if you set that precedent, one day it will come back and attack you as well. It's no one's safe. So the principle of free speech is much, much, much bigger than Trump. And the incitement question is a red herring. You know, I mean, incitement in the UK has always been illegal. It's illegal under English. Again, even here, you would need a lot more to meet the definition.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into some more of that in just a second. I want to know though, was your family, you know, back in Londonderry or Derry, depending on your persuasion, whether or not you're a Protestant or a Catholic, I guess, but was your family an especially political one? Because it strikes me that you must have been brought up in an environment in which you were able to discuss and debate ideas, because I don't mean to sort of dive headfirst into sycophancy, but I do genuinely believe that you are one of the most wonderfully eloquent polemicists on all the social justice activism that I've heard. You've certainly given me a lot of food for thought over the past year or two.
Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate that. It's very kind. I should just correct you there insofar as I didn't grow up in Londonderry.
Oh, did you
Derry,
not?
or whatever you want to call it. No, I've had that a couple of times, but it's an odd one. I think it's simply because
the internet is a liar. Can you believe this is disinformation?
No, it is true that my family are Northern Ireland. My mother was raised in 500 meters from the Bogside in Derry, and
right.
She moved back there when I was a teenager. And I obviously spent an awful lot of time there from there on. So yeah, so that it's not incorrect. I won't go into the reason why she moved away.
No.
Because it's a very long, silly story involving Tony Blackburn, so we won't go into that. But it actually does involve Tony Blackburn. But
That's hilarious.
But it is just as well she did. Because she literally missed out all of the troubles, which was great. But however, on the other hand, of course, coming from that background, and if you consider, I mean, you know, she's one of 10. They've all got kids. I've got so many cousins. All of my family, or a significant proportion of my family, are in Derry, in Northern Ireland. We have always called it Derry. I've never called it Londonderry because my family are Catholics. In terms of politics, well, yes, there are people in my family who are very political.
Were you brought up with a religious background yourself then? Do you still hold faith, or not, or did you ever hold faith, I guess?
Oh yeah, I did and do. Well, insofar as I went to a convent school, so it's about as religious as you can get, I guess. I same thing as everyone else. I went to church every week. I was very religious. I didn't actually have non-Catholic friends until university, actually. I mean, because I not only went to a Catholic primary school and secondary school, but also went to a Catholic sixth form. So I just didn't, so it was just sort of built in. So yeah, and that's still with me, I suppose. So that's still there. But I'm not, I wouldn't say I'm the best Catholic in terms of my conduct, but we're all sinners.
Oh, absolutely. Forgiving sinners. But I mean, Andrew, there's a debate around, I guess, the sort of religiosity of the woke movement, of the social justice activism. I wonder then, with
Yeah.
your religious hat on, in recognizing what a organized religion looks like, and those more learned than I am have been identifying that these movements are indeed, in fact, very religious. I wonder what you
Yeah,
make
so
of that argument.
I see what you're driving at there. I suppose you could say that for instance, the conflict in Northern Ireland, and coming from a Northern Irish family, I can see, I do have an insight into that it is actually very tribal. That a lot of that is not, it's not about, I mean, I remember reading Michael Moore's book, one of his books, I can't remember which one it was now. It was the one that did very well. And there was a chapter on Northern Ireland, and he was frankly so ill-informed about it. And he really did think it was all about religion. He thought it was about a group of people who believed in transubstantiation and a group of people who didn't. I think that's what he thought, and of course, it absolutely had nothing to do with religion. It was to do with tribalism on the one hand. It was to do with injustice as well. It was to do with the fact that you couldn't, the gerrymandering that was going on in Northern Ireland, which would sustain a Protestant majority council, even in Derry, where 70% of the town were Catholic. I mean, there was real corruption going on there. Catholics didn't have rights; they couldn't get jobs. You couldn't get a vote unless you had a house, and the Protestant council were the ones who determined whether or not you got a house. So there were all sorts of genuine civil rights struggles that needed to be had at that point. However, once it kicked off, and once the British soldiers arrived on the streets, and at first, you've got to remember that the nationalist community and the Catholic community embraced the soldiers and saw them very much as protecting them against the RUC, or what it is now called the PSNI, the Police Service Northern Ireland, then the Royal Ulster Constabulary. So it was very much an understandable, albeit regrettable, situation. But it very quickly became tribal, and an awful lot of sectarian elements and sectarian killings occurred, and it then became. There was that grisly element which just bubbled to the fore, and so that's always made me very mistrustful. I'm for civil rights and I'm for peaceful protest and all the rest of it, but when you see that sort of flagrantly, and I have heard flagrantly sectarian things over there, then you start to realize that actually a lot of what this is about is wanting to be part of a team, wanting to feel like you've got a struggle, particularly with young men. I think young men, I spoke to an old IRA member who said that he enjoyed it. He just enjoyed it. He was talking about the Battle of the Bogside in particular, which was when the police had sort of stormed into the Bogside and was smashing windows and attacking the Catholic community. But for once, the Catholic community fought back, which was a necessary thing to have happened. But he was talking about the sheer adrenaline and the fun. You've got to remember that actually being part of a struggle, young men in particular enjoy it. So there's all of that going on as well. But really, the tribal loyalty is ultimately what took over.
Was it looking for to belong to something bigger than yourself? Then was it sort of giving these men a sense of purpose, and that's. I mean, do you tie it into all of these wider movements? Is that why people, can justify violence today, for example?
Right, exactly. Yes, I think it's part of it. Whereas the difference, of course, is that now, unfortunately, a lot of the people who are on the more extreme fringes of the social justice movement, who will resort to violence, have no way the kind of legitimate grievances that the Catholics in Northern Ireland had. That it just doesn't even come close. And what they have is a kind of either a manufactured grievance or a fantastical belief that the world is unjust and that certain people are privileged by dint of their skin color, and or certain people are oppressed because of these nebulous invisible power structures that exist in society. So they are coming from a completely different, but the principle is the same, that they I mean, I don't know. You'd have to. Each individual is different, but I should imagine a lot of the people that get involved in the protests that turn into riots. I think there is something potentially quite enjoyable about destruction, and that's something that is probably in human nature, and we should be aware of. And as ever with this stuff, there's always a kernel of truth. There is always injustice in society in certain areas, and if you can convince yourself that the only response to that is violent action, then you can end up doing anything, and you can end up committing atrocities and thinking you're good. And I think what really worries me about a lot of what's happening with the social justice movement is that some of the, I mean, we've seen it online. I mean, this is obviously a microcosm and it's a smaller scale, but a lot of the viciousness online that you see from the social justice people is, I mean, it's beyond the pale. I've never seen anything like it, but particularly over the past few years, it's really escalated. And yet I also see that I had one the other day, some bizarre woman started attacking me in this most aggressive way.
Do you
And you
read
could
it all? Do you read all of your replies?
I don't see a lot of them because I don't
That would I don't mean to sound like a sort of wallflower, but that would drive me up the wall, Andrew. Honestly, that would really drive me
you just not
insane.
read your comments.
No, I don't read them. No.
Yeah, well, I tell you why I do, because I think I like to engage people wherever possible, even if they disagree. And if there is a chance that you can just even sow the seeds in their mind that actually maybe this person I've monstered in my head, I've just turned into this demon. Maybe I'm wrong. If even if they say, you know, fuck you, Nazi, and they storm off, but something in their head, they suddenly realize, oh, hold a minute, he didn't respond in the way I wanted him to respond. He didn't do that. It can sow the seeds of doubt, and that can do something that's good. However,
so
I think
I agree with that.
But once it gets very, very abusive, I just block them and move on, because you can't. I mean, here's the thing. I'm getting a lot of this, by the way, at the moment. It was people. This is the most. Well, I find this the most fascinating, fundamental misunderstanding about free speech. You always get, oh, well, if you're blocking people, you're depriving them of free speech. You're not pro free speech. This is asinine. A very fundamental aspect of free speech is the right not to listen. And when it comes to no one's free speech is deprived by blocking them. I've been blocked by hundreds, if not thousands, of people online. My free speech has been in no way compromised by this, and I'm still free to go and say whatever I want. They don't have to listen to me. But the best way to judge it, I think, for a start, when you get a certain number of followers on Twitter, as you will know, I don't think it's actually sustainable without the block button. I don't think Twitter can possibly work, because there's too many people who want to attack you and mass report you, more to the point, which is why muting isn't such a good idea, because if you mute them, they can still keep reporting, and then you'll be booted anyway. But I think the test should be this. If someone walked up to me on the street and said something to me, would I engage with that person, or would I just walk away? You know? So if someone came up to me and said, look, I really disagreed with what you said on this position, so can we discuss that? I would say, yes, of course, let's have that discussion. That's the same that would go on Twitter, right? If someone came up to me and said, you're a really ugly Nazi and you should die, and I'm not going to say, okay, that's really interesting, let's discuss that a bit further. You're just going to walk away, aren't you? So obviously that's the test. That's what you should do.
That's a good test, and it tends to work the other way around in my experience. So there's been a few times where I've bumped into these people at certain, whether that be at, I don't know, a party or at the pub or a club even, and I've walked up to them and I've known that they've said things about me on Twitter, and it tends to be actually that accusing me of transphobia, and I've walked over and I've said, I saw what you said on Twitter. I didn't actually respond, but I wondered if you'd like to actually talk about it now, because I actually find it's obviously a hell of a lot easier without the character limit, right? And also because they're not performing for anyone, and they always with each example they crumble like crisp packets in an open flame, and they can't sustain their argument. They can't sustain the argument that you are inherently prejudiced towards trans people or hateful towards trans people, for arguing that actually if we render the term woman meaningless, we render sex meaningless and same-sex attraction meaningless. And when you stood in a gay club at that point, they sort of start to think these things through and think, well, actually, yeah, maybe he does have a point. Maybe words do have meaning, and we can't just walk around self-identifying and all the rest of it. And you can't have these conversations on Twitter, right? You just can't do that.
No. I mean,
so I don't bother. Does that make me cowardly? I don't know.
No, not at all. It makes you incredibly sensible. You know, as you say, it becomes a competition of ego, and I'm not interested in that. And in fact, whenever I detect that in myself, I withdraw anyway, because I don't want to become that. I don't want to do that, because everyone has an ego, and particularly, you know, people who are in the arts, we have a sizable ego, and you have to guard against that. And if you suddenly find I'm now arguing because I want to win and I want people to see that I've won, then I'll just withdraw and I'll just block, and that'll be that. And I think that's. And because so much of it is just childish. However, I do believe, though, that there are well-intentioned, good people who oppose what I say, people I've been very critical of, and I would always want to have a conversation with those people. First and foremost, I would want to have a conversation with those people, but I want it to be a sensible adult conversation, and not one that is dripping with bile. The real problem that you have now is that so much of the opposite, so much of those who oppose what I'm saying are fighting against an imaginary enemy, and they've decided that I believe things I don't believe. So
Yes.
half of the arguments I get into are me clarifying and explaining to them that I don't believe the things they claim that I do.
What? So, no, I'm not a Nazi.
Well, no, it's actually even more basic than
Right.
that. You know, you would have it like, oh, well, you vote Tory and therefore you think this. And I'm like, I've never voted Tory in my life. Oh, okay. Yeah, but you're a straight white male. And then, okay, I'm not heterosexual. And then it's, oh, yeah, but okay, fine. But you believe, and honestly, it's like that a lot of the time. And it's like, oh, and what was the one I had yesterday? That in my stand-up, all I do is stand there and talk about identifying as an attack helicopter. And I'm like, well, no one's actually made that joke for 5 years. It's an old meme. But I've never made that joke in my stand-up or anything remotely resembling it. Have you actually seen my stand-up? Yeah, I've seen clips. Okay, so you know that what you just said isn't true, don't you? And if you talk to them like this and get them just to, then ultimately either they have to admit their dishonesty, or they have to confront the fact that they're not being dishonest, but they are convincing themselves of a reality that doesn't exist. And that's sometimes very helpful to people. But it is, yeah, it's infuriating and it's time consuming. And sometimes I just think I can't be bothered because I'm busy. But if I'm on the train or something and I've got nothing to do, I will have these big long conversations because actually I quite enjoy it. You know, I quite enjoy trying to get them to. It's a challenge, you know, because you're talking to someone who is incapable of reason. Now it's like talking to a child. And I used to be a teacher, and sometimes with a child, it can be infuriating. But if you persist, you can get them to see sense and you can get them to realize something, even though they may not admit it. I hope it's potentially doing good.
Yeah. Now, Andrew, can you explain how these activists engage also in your, I guess it's not your theory, it's not unique to you, I don't think you invented it, but gaslighting. And I think the most recent example has to be the way in which, and I know you saw this because I saw that you tweeted about it, after Parler was pulled from Amazon's web services, The Guardian ran a piece in which they listed government ministers. I am making a little list, said The Guardian. Government ministers, Conservative Party MPs and non-entities like me, for some reason, were highlighted as being users of Parler. And in this piece, they tried to smear all of those users of the platform as being guilty by association of being far right, of I guess association with the far right. Now that strikes me as patently ridiculous, and the journalist Stephen Pollard pointed out that he's not guilty by association of being, associated with Corbynite anti-Semites because he's on Twitter with them. And the same thing happened with Gab after that. Was sort of they tried to sort of smear people and gaslight people by saying, well, you're on a platform with the far right. What do you think about that, mate? And what is this phenomenon, and how do you what do you put it down to?
Yeah, I mean, the word that you've used, gaslighting, is. I didn't realize you were on the list, by the way. Well done. I got accused of being on the list. Someone again only yesterday was talking about how I'm only upset because I can't be on Parler anymore. I've never been on Parler, by the way, but I always supported it because I think you need to have alternative platforms. You need to challenge. I thought
you would have joined.
Yeah, but I don't want to learn anything new. Because I remember
you wrote that piece on for Spiked. Yeah.
Yeah, I wrote a piece about 6 months ago saying everyone should get on Parler, and I didn't. And that's pure laziness. I don't want to learn a new thing. It's like I'm on Instagram, but I don't know how to use it. I post the odd photo when I'm walking in fields. I normally just take pictures of sheep. That's the only thing I use Instagram for, because I think people think I'm like a sheep fetishist or something. But I don't because I don't know how to use it. I don't know how to reply. I don't know how to. I honestly haven't. I just can't be bothered to learn things like that. So I sound like a Luddite now, and it's weird, isn't it? Because I make my career on Twitter. But nevertheless, the word you used is right, gaslighting. And that is actually a word that comes from the social justice movement. This is something that I don't know if they invented this. It might go back further because, of course, it goes back to that 1940 film, Gaslight, where the man is persuading or tricking his wife into thinking that she's insane by changing things around the house. So, for instance, he will dim the light, and she'll say, "Why is it dark in here?" And he'll say, "It's not. It's just you're insane." And this is what gaslighting means. It means that someone raises a point, and then you deny the observable reality, so that they start doubting their own critical faculties. And that's what gaslighting is, and that's what they are doing at the moment. It's actually one of my main concerns, it's not just the Guardian and the New Statesman and those kind of activist publications, although they are engaging in it an awful lot now, which is why I think, I mean, even friends of mine, I've got friends who write for the Guardian, for goodness sake. I've got all of my friends who read the Guardian. A lot of them have stopped reading the Guardian now because it's too overt. And this is now something that's extremely common, particularly on the left. And we've seen this with the BBC talking about the mostly peaceful protest where 29 police officers were injured. Doesn't sound mostly peaceful to me. Similarly, in America, when you had the CNN's Chiron talking about largely peaceful protests, while literally the city is on fire behind the reporter. And it's this idea that you had it recently with Joe Biden talking about how had the protest at the Capitol been a Black Lives Matter protest, the police would have been much more violent. Well, the obvious truth is that the opposite is true, because we saw what happened. The police don't intervene when Black Lives Matter protests turn violent. They just don't. We've got months and months of evidence of that. So just stating the observable falsehood. Now, similarly, the Guardian, and particularly certain columnists who I won't mention by name, or I could do, but there's no point. Will say things like the culture war is a right-wing invention, a right-wing myth. When, of course, The Guardian is the publication that has done more than any other to stoke the culture war. Similarly, you have people saying
cancel culture as well. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, great minds.
The people who, well, there we go. But the people who say that are the chief practitioners of cancel culture.
Yes, exactly.
So again, now what did it? Now I think this is fascinating because I never like to assume that people are lying, but the alternative is even more sinister. Because the alternative is that they've actually started to believe their own fantasies. That's a worry, right? So and I think they do believe these fantasies. They believe the fantasy ever since Brexit that 17.4 million people in this country are evil racists who hate foreigners. They believe that fantasy. They perpetuated that fantasy. In fact, it was through the perpetuation of that fantasy during the Brexit campaign that I have no doubt tipped it towards Brexit. That's why Brexit won. I've no doubt, because people will resent that, because good people don't like to be called racist, which isn't a surprise. And they've bought into this myth that we live in this world that is crawling with fascists, and I think they do believe it. That's what's even scarier. If they were just lying for an agenda, which I've no doubt some of them are, I mean, the cancel culture one is particularly egregious because the evidence of it is so overwhelming. I mean, I wrote an article about this the other day, and I put a link into a Twitter thread which collates instances of cancel culture, and there are thousands, absolutely thousands. And then someone else sent me another link of another online collection of instances, and these are people who've been fired, ordinary people who just get fired for a joke they've told online, or a joke that was overheard in the canteen and someone complained or whatever, and they're so well documented. We just hear about the high profile ones, don't we? We hear about mostly the celebrity ones when it happens. And so of course what you end up with is people in the Guardian saying, well, it's just the rich and powerful and it's celebrities being held to account. Well, 99.9% of the people who are quote unquote cancelled are ordinary working people who simply don't have the resources to support themselves when those things happen. And therefore that's why things like the Free Speech Union are so important.
That's why I love the Free Speech Union. I think they do absolutely sterling work. Yes. I really do think it's the most important outlet that's been set up over recent years. Absolutely.
It's very important. I mean, and even with people who oppose a lot of the views that Toby Young has, for instance, and will therefore attack it on that basis, they're very much missing the point. It doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree with Toby's point of view on various things. Look at the people that it's actually helped. Look at the people who have actually needed the support of the Free Speech Union. You know, people like Nick Buckley, who was fired from it. You know, a man who's done so much charity work for ethnic minority people in this country, who was suddenly accused of being racist.
Yeah, he got an MBE for his troubles with his charity work. You know, that's how selfless he was in that pursuit.
Right, exactly. But if it wasn't, you see, someone in that position who doesn't have a column in a national newspaper, who doesn't have, you know, in the way that J.K. Rowling cannot be cancelled because she's a billionaire and she is the most famous author in the world, but someone who's a lesser known author will certainly be cancelled. We saw that with Gillian Phillip, the Scottish author. Now, she was ditched by her publisher and her agent because she supported J.K. Rowling. That's it. Just a tweet of support. That's all it took. There was that woman at the Tobias Literary Agency in New York who got fired because she tweeted out, it was a polite opinion on her private Twitter account where she said that she didn't feel that gendered pronouns or gender neutral pronouns are helpful to the feminist cause, which is a perfectly legitimate opinion to hold. And she was fired. And she wasn't, you know, she doesn't command an 8-figure salary like J.K. Rowling, and she can't defend herself. So people like that will be the ones that an organization like the Free Speech Union will help. And again, you get the same accusation, and it's very, very tiresome, which is that the only reason that people stand up for free speech is that they want to call everyone racist, use racist terminology, use homophobic terminology, have a go at the gays, have a go at trans people. And that's what free speech is really all about. Now, again, this is one of those mass delusions. It is a delusion, and it is a fantasy. Because whenever someone says that to me, I always ask them, well, what is your evidence for this? Why do you think this? And it ultimately, when you push people on this, they have to admit that they just believe it, that they just intuit it. Or what they do is they take the success of Brexit as evidence. But of course, their premise, which is that if you voted Brexit, you were a racist, was a false premise to begin with. So you can't just establish a false premise and then use it to establish your false conclusion. Well, you can do that, but it's ludicrous. So, and this is why I'm glad you mentioned this gaslighting thing, because I'm really genuinely concerned, because you can argue with someone who is wrong, who is demonstrably wrong, if they are open to the rules of debate. If they are willing to accept that once presented with empirical data that disproves their point of view, then they will accept that they are wrong about something. This is the core of argument. This is the core of being an adult, actually, is your willingness to be challenged. If someone proves me wrong, if I write something that is factually incorrect, and someone comes to me and says, this is factually incorrect, and here is the evidence, and here is why, my instinct is actually to thank them. I understand the impulse to feel a bit aggrieved because your ego has had a knock. As in, you've put something out there that wasn't true, that was false, and therefore, you've made a mistake, and no one likes to make a mistake, but we're human beings, and it is inevitable that we will do so. Surely, gratitude should be the response, because it means that you prevent yourself from making the mistake in the future. It's a good thing to be proven wrong, and it's something that we should all, when we engage in an argument, I always say this, I remember, I think it was Owen Jones talking about how he was actually making the point that you should engage with people who aren't of your political persuasion, which isn't a view that he often expresses, but it was something he did express. But his argument was that by doing so, you could refine your own argument, right? In other words, you could learn better how to anticipate the rebuttals. But actually, that's not the reason you should argue. And this is the thing he didn't say, which is that the reason you argue is that you might be wrong. And you should always be aware that you might be wrong, and unless you have that, and if you are a social justice activist, then what you will notice is that the common factor, the thing that I find genuinely chilling, the most frightening thing about that movement, is the sheer certainty. And when they talk about things, it's that it has never crossed their mind that they could be wrong. It's never crossed their mind. It doesn't even occur to them, and that's why they believe they have reached this kind of zenith of human morality, where they are in a position not only to judge everyone else around them, but people from the past as well. So they believe that they are at this unique point in humanity where they are right about absolutely everything. Of course, what they should know if they read any kind of history book, what they will know is that in 100 years' time, people will be judging them, ridiculing them. If there's statues to them, they may be tearing them down too, for the beliefs that they hold today. So, a little bit of humility goes a long way, and it's what's lacking in that movement.
Absolutely. Beautifully put. I wonder then, how do you think, because one charge that they often come with as well as the gaslighting and the sort of cancel culture doesn't exist, you're just making that up to justify your own sort of longing to be racist, homophobic and transphobic online. But another way in which I think, especially the tech giants, justify censorship, putting disclaimers on Trump tweets before they ultimately kicked him off altogether, is through that lens of disinformation. But had I advocated, Andrew, where early on in the pandemic, when the World Health Organization advice was against mask wearing, I'd have been guilty of disinformation had I said I think we should all wear masks. And were Twitter around in the 90s, I mean, admittedly, I wouldn't have been alive, but in the early 90s, and I tweeted in favor of gay rights, the World Health Organization at that time, I believe, had homosexuality on its list of official mental disorders up until the early 90s. So would I have had
It was 1990, I think, or 91.
Okay.
Yeah.
So would I have had a sort of disinformation label then? I mean, what is the sort of response for advocates of free speech to this clamp down on so-called disinformation and fake news? And by the way, it strikes me that the biggest, those who talk most or wax lyrical the most about fake news tend to be the biggest propagators of it, if you ask me. But
Well, I mean,
hey ho.
you could accuse the WHO earlier last year were saying that masks were completely not effective. So you could quite easily level that charge at them. I mean, I wouldn't want to do that, because everyone gets things wrong. I mean, this is the point. Is that for a start, the phrase fake news is often used really as a label just to smear an opinion that you don't like. That's the first thing that happens, and it happens across the board. Donald Trump did it as well. Let's be honest about this. So the phrase was used just to dismiss a point of view that you don't like. Although actually the phrase fake news originates from the left. I think I used to see it early on in the I think then Trump sort of co-opted it. The problem is that the best way there will always be misinformation, but people should be allowed to make mistakes, right? If we don't make mistakes, then we don't grow, we don't develop, we don't innovate. So we can be wrong about things all the time. It shouldn't be against the law to be factually wrong about things. And the way that you deal with factual inaccuracies, you see, is, of course, as you know, to challenge those inaccuracies with better data and better arguments.
Yeah.
But the problem is you can't do that in a society in which free speech is stifled. And a lot of the people who are talking about fake news, they've already established what narrative they want, and they've already established what set of facts that they approve of, and therefore nothing will get challenged, and more to the point, they won't get challenged. So that's the real danger of suggesting that misinformation is justification for censorship. Actually, it's the reverse. Misinformation is justification for even more speech, because that's the way that you will correct these things. I mean, to give an extreme example, if you take the historian David Irving, who was denied the Holocaust explicitly, and he was imprisoned for that. Now, what that did was make him a martyr amongst a certain unpleasant community. It also lent a kind of a sheen of glamour and credence to his views. The most effective challenge to David Irving came from the historian Richard Evans, who systematically and forensically dismantled his argument through facts and data. And that's why we don't take it seriously. And once you've done that, then the position becomes unsustainable, and that's how it should be, right? Yeah. But if you just silence someone, even lock them up, then you start generating this sense of, oh well, maybe they were onto something. Why are they clamping down on this person? Maybe because so many of the people who deliberately spread malicious fake news or malicious disinformation depend upon this narrative that they are brave truth tellers who are constantly being censored and silenced, right? This was why it was such a bad idea to kick Alex Jones off. And that's Alex Jones's whole thing. That was his whole point, is that there's a big establishment that are trying to silence him all the time. And then what did they do? They proved him right. Are you crazy? This is the last thing you ought to do. So it really is. I cannot emphasize enough. It's always about, I see things online that are either wrong. Often things are said about me that are factually wrong, and I try to correct them where I can. But sometimes you can't talk to those people. But when I see things that are wrong or I think could potentially be spreading a dangerous message, then I challenge it and I call on others to challenge it. Because if I call for it to be silenced, then I think they've won.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the left, as someone who you still identify with the left, right?
It's very complicated. I think left and right has become pretty much meaningless now. I don't get to decide what is left wing and what is right wing, but nor do these people either, right? So there are many decades of writing on both on both ideas, and I just don't think we get to decide that. If you were to write down my views, particularly about the economy, particularly about proportionate taxation of the rich and wealth distribution and the welfare state, etc., then objectively most of my views are traditionally left-wing views. My opposition to the EU is very much a left-wing view. It's a very left-wing position to hold. Mm-hmm. In fact, I would go so far as to say it's incoherent to be supportive of the EU and call yourself left-wing. I don't think you can do that. But similarly, I would
unless you assume that the EU one day is going to become some sort of Marxist utopia, which seems to be what some people, especially in the early days, yeah.
I suppose I'm talking about the idea of voting in favour of a pro-corporate neoliberal trading bloc.
Yes.
In which big business pays millions for lawyers to lobby for extra regulation because it will force out smaller businesses. That to me, it doesn't strike me as a particularly leftist position to hold. If you support
or a trading bloc that refuses to give people votes on trade agreements because it worries that actually they might not vote in favour of them. That sort of thing.
Yeah, or indeed having decisions rushed through a commission of people who have absolutely no accountability to the electorate, right? So all
Absolutely.
of this stuff none of this is remotely left-wing. It's the opposite. In fact, anyone who was seriously on the left, if you just go back 10 years, 15 years, no one would have seriously been supportive of the EU and still call themselves left-wing. This is a very new thing. It's not even about left and right. That became about good versus evil. It was more a kind of theological thing more than anything. Or in their minds it was, that's how it sort of became. Because how else do you explain the absolute fervor of people out there with blue face paint, flying EU flags, screaming online about this passion? They didn't care about this block in 2015. They didn't even know about it. You can't become that passionate about something. I don't believe you can become that passionate about something unless you are bought into a mass delusion, or you're kidding yourself, or you're lying. It's one of those. It isn't. It's anyway. Let's leave that aside. What was the question? I can't.
Well,
remember
the question is actually, if we put aside then the
Am
sort
I
of
left or right?
label of left. Well, it was, but if we put aside that sort of label of left, if you I guess you yourself would be branded as far right by some completely, I think, idiotic people online, right? But it strikes me as an inherently left-wing, you might dismiss me on this, but hear me out, an inherently left-wing or liberal argument, and I don't mean liberal in the American sense of the word, I mean, liberal in the classical liberal tradition, but that sort of position to believe that you shouldn't judge people on their immutable characteristics, for example, because that just strikes, I was brought up not to do that, right? And it just strikes me that that's part of being a decent, good person and morally right. Nowadays, that view makes a person, I guess I'd be accused of being guilty of displaying some form of white privilege or something like that for not viewing people through their immutable characteristics. Right. So my question was going to be, where did the left go wrong? But would you just not describe these people as left?
I don't think they are left-wing. I don't think you can be. I also think civil rights, for instance, I think the civil rights movement was so interconnected with the new left, of the 1960s. And I think that because this current social justice movement is a reaction against the civil rights movement, and yet it believes itself to be a continuation of it. I mean, that's the very interesting thing, is that that you even have some activists now problematizing Martin Luther King, even going so far as to imply that he suffered from internalized racism because he believed in this ideal of colorblindness. But colorblindness is the liberal ideal, because it means that it doesn't mean that you don't see race. That's a ridiculous misinterpretation. Of course, we all see it. It means that you don't treat people differently because of it. And how that can be anything other than noble and good and virtuous, I don't understand. So the left-right thing, it's very, very... I mean, I should say, by the way, that I'm quite culturally conservative. And I think in terms of the arts, and I think for education, certainly, I think you need to learn the canon. I think you need to have a body of knowledge. I think you need to draw on that. But I also... I suppose politically, I would be aligned with someone like George Orwell, who is left wing on virtually on everything, but is culturally conservative, and that's I think cultural conservatism actually is pretty much part of the left wing tradition. So
you're describing most of my family. Most of my family that voted Labour tribally all of their lives, and then my granddad, worked down the pit for so long he couldn't any longer extend his arm fully. He voted Conservative in 2017. That was his last vote before he passed away, and he voted Conservative. Now that sent shockwaves through me. I just thought, bloody hell, if he can vote Conservative, anyone. And it's because of the same things that you're mentioning. Yes, very economically left-wing, former trade unionist and all the rest of it, but with very culturally conservative views. He actually quite liked his country. Shock.
It's important. It's important if if you don't have anything, if you read, people want to understand how difficult life has been for people in the industrial heartlands. If you read something like The Road to Wigan Pier by George Orwell, and you think, the people living in these conditions, I would have been dead in 2 days. Like, I'm so pampered. When I read this stuff, I just realize how pampered I am. And in those community is important. Community and tradition and even patriotism, and these things matter because that you need something bigger than yourself. And the idea of destroying that, it's a very bourgeois thing. It's a very middle class luxury to be able to say that none of these things matter. And this is the problem. And you're absolutely right to point out about your father voting Conservative, because I don't think people fully grasp.
Oh,
the
Granddad
significance
Andrew,
of
father
that.
wasn't in the picture. He was useless.
Oh, sorry, grandfather. Sorry.
Yeah.
But the idea of I don't think people grasp the weight of that. When you talk to the people in those communities, the hatred for Margaret Thatcher is so intense. The hatred for what the Tories did in the miners' strikes in the 1980s, the visceral feeling of resentment, and yet in spite of that, they can still put an X next to that
Yeah.
name.
Yeah.
That's astonishing. I couldn't even bring myself to do it. I have a lot of issues with the Tories in the past, and I in this election, even though I thought the threat of Brexit not being pushed through would have been utterly disastrous to the democracy of this country. It would have been a shocking thing. Even I, in those circumstances, couldn't bring myself to vote Tory, and I spoiled my ballot. But you see, but for people in that community to do it is even more astonishing. And people need to understand that by constantly attacking the poorest in society, which is what is happening here, the left, and by the way, I think the left reneging on its traditional responsibility to look out for working class people, to push for social mobility, and to be class conscious, to have an awareness that money is the key source of privilege. The economy is what is at the heart of leftism. If you don't believe that, I don't see how you can be truly left wing. If you substitute money for the politics of identity, for race, gender, and sexuality, then I don't think that's an authentically left-wing position. I think the mistake they're making is that it's because the left has traditionally been so active in terms of civil rights and equality, right, issues, which are things that I would support, and I do feel are part of my political background, which would be a left-wing background. But there's a difference. There's a distinction between the luminaries of the civil rights movement and what's happening now. They were not identitarians in that way. What they were saying is we should look beyond race, we should look beyond sexuality, we should be the same. Now it is the opposite. Now it is about a new form of segregation almost. And I don't use that term lightly. I mean, when you saw the autonomous zone, Capitol Hill autonomous zone, where they had a black only area, which weirdly enough was guarded by white people, or you have dormitories in universities which exist even over here in the UK, where they're LGBT only dormitory. Like this
well, you've
idea
even got
that
organisations like Sainsbury's, right, saying that their black colleagues will be able to have their own safe spaces.
And it's difficult, isn't it? Because it's incredibly patronizing. I mean, the idea that the tragic killing of a black man 4,000 miles away, that should have a deep, profound emotional impact on employees of Sainsbury's in the UK simply because of the color of their skin, is a kind of it's a kind of soft racism, insofar as it is incredibly patronizing and paternalistic. It's a hyper racialized view of society, and it's very difficult to know what to call this, because I worry about the fact that the word racist is being thrown around by absolutely everyone, so it doesn't really mean anything anymore. And to that extent, I don't like to use it myself. I know in America that I was speaking to Peter Boghossian the other day. He started to think about it in terms of neo-racism. I know it's certainly a sort of hyper-racialized view of society, where you actually see everything through skin color first. It is the opposite of what the civil rights movement were pushing for. Similarly with gay rights, it's the absolute of the whole point of the gay rights movement was we're born this way, we're the same, we should have equality.
Or even, trans people who just want to be left alone in society. They just want to be able to live their lives. And there's a sort of minority of activists who seem hell-bent on ensuring they can't.
Yeah, and a lot of trans people are deeply disturbed. I remember seeing a video by Blair White about the J.K. Rowling controversy, and she was pointing out that underneath that, the original tweet that J.K. Rowling put out that caused all the problem, most of the support there was coming from trans people. Most of the support, it isn't the case that the trans community is as aggressive and vicious and misogynistic as this minority of activists are. It is a small minority, but it makes it very, very difficult for trans people when you have this small group who those are the people inevitably that everyone hears. I'm thinking, when I was at school, there was a long way to go for gay equality. I remember working as part-time as a receptionist at a blood clinic which was terrible for me because I'm very squeamish. I can't stand the sight of blood. In fact, I only took the job because I said, I'll do it as long as I don't have to see any blood. And then on the first day, someone came in with 3 bags of blood and dumped them on the desk and said, I'll deal with that. I'm like, I can't. Anyway, so that happened. But at that point, I remember talking to my colleague there and saying, well, I think gay marriage that's a no-brainer. It should happen. And she laughed so much. She actually ran across the office to tell someone else. She found it so funny. Right now, the idea that now it's just a norm. When I was at school, like, to be gay was just the go-to insult. The one boy who was a bit camp was bullied.
Well, even I don't wish to make you sound old at all, and forgive me for couching it in these terms. But even when I was at school, it was the same.
Wasn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Oh, yeah. But you've got to remember that I've been a school teacher not that long ago.
That is true. When did you stop being a school teacher?
Well, I've seen pupils who are out, for instance.
Yeah.
Right. So that would never have been conceivable.
Yeah,
when I was young.
I came out when I was 13, but it was sort of like you beat out of the closet and you're just like, well, do you know what? They've called me gay since I was about 5 years old. I might as well just say, yeah, do you know what? I am actually. You hear something enough times.
I don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that there isn't homophobia in school. In fact, I imagine that the problems that with homophobia that still exist will be when people are young. But what I am saying is that the very idea of coming out when I was at school in the 90s would have been absolutely impossible, not least because the teachers were as openly homophobic as anyone else. So I think, the things have changed. So, and the idea of gay marriage was just, it's the stuff of fantasy. And yet now we have it. And now it's sort of a given that the idea that anyone would oppose it seems weird. So the rapidity of that is but my point was simply this, that had it been the case that when gay rights activists, I mean, before my time, but when people had really tough struggles, and were being routinely attacked on the street, had there been a small minority of gay activists who just were extreme and were causing literal physical violence and all that. I mean, even if you go to like Outrage, which was Peter Tatchell's organization, they didn't physically attack people. They were pretty in your face. And then, they would, for instance, they would rush into churches where if there was a priest, for instance, who was very anti-gay, very openly homophobic, but was living a secret gay life, they would often out that person. Now, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with those tactics, but what they didn't do was beat him up. Yeah. And what they didn't do is send these vicious, vile attacks. I mean, what you're seeing from, if people don't believe me, there's an article on Medium which collects together all of the screenshots of the people who've been attacking J.K. Rowling online. And what is interesting about them is it's not just sexually threatening. It's also, I'm talking rape threats as well, but it is fundamentally misogynistic. It is talking about her genitalia in the most grotesque terms. It is talking about it's her as a woman. It's very specifically, we hate you because you are a woman. I actually have never seen such overt misogyny. And again, the phrase misogyny is a phrase that I don't use lightly because I don't like words being thrown around. People think misogyny means someone who's a bit mean to a woman at one point. It's not that. Misogyny is hatred of women. And this is genuine hatred of women because she's a woman. So I think, and what that does is that actually has a negative impact on your cause. Now most people associate being trans with these shrill, horrible people. And that is not who the vast majority of trans people just want to get decent people who want to get on with their lives, and they're not into all of this stuff. So it is counterproductive and very, very unfortunate.
Where does this all end then? In your book, do you sort of make any? I don't wish to ask if you're a clairvoyant. I'm not going to make you play Mystic Meg. But does your book sort of, do you predict that we're going to end up, with Titania McGrath banishing us all to the gulags, or do you have any sort of optimism that things will actually get better?
I actually say the opposite. I say I don't think we're heading towards the gulags. I am an optimist. That's why I'm a satirist, because you can't be a satirist unless you believe that things can change for the better. So I think we can. The whole point of the book is saying, look, I'm not saying we're at crisis point yet, but we are seeing the problems in society. We're seeing the fissures in the barricade that we erect to protect ourselves. Civilization has this barricade against this collapse into chaos. And we're seeing those fissures widening now, and that we have to be vigilant. Every successive generation has to stand up for free speech and defend it anew. It's not something that once it's established, it's there forever. and we know that from history. It can fall apart just as easily. And you know, in America, you now have people calling for changes to the First Amendment so that it doesn't cover quote unquote hate speech. In the book, I make the argument that hate speech isn't a thing, and should, in fact, there shouldn't be hate speech legislation on any statute books in any liberal democracy.
Well, I am guilty of a non-crime hate incident, let's not forget.
Yes,
so...
well,
Who isn't?
A lot of people are. I know,
yeah.
exactly. It seems to be the thing. You know, the police should not be auditing our emotions or arresting people or investigating people for their emotions, and hate is an emotion. You shouldn't have the police investigating anyone for non-crime, as you know. Between 2014 and 2019, there's 120,000 non-crime hate incidents investigated by the police. That's an awful lot of police time wasted. But worse than that, it is a deeply authoritarian. And the reason why this matters is that, you know, we can say, well, look, a non-crime hate incident isn't going to result in a prosecution. Well, it isn't. It does go on your DBS check, though, and that can cause problems for employers. But the real issue is, what kind of precedent is this setting? If you would have been able to speak to someone even just 15 years ago, and if you'd have said to them, there will come a time in the UK when the police will be investigating people routinely for non-crime, nobody would have believed you. So, and yet that's where we're at now. It's happened, right? So that shows that we are on this dangerous trajectory that we need to correct. Because if we don't correct it, it will only get worse. You know, once you allow liberty to slip away, once you relinquish that, it's very hard to claw it back. So I think what the book is really about is just urging people to be vigilant, urging people to stand up for this principle, and most particularly and most difficult of all is to stand up for the principle even when the person is saying horrible, unpleasant things. That's when it's most important, because what you're doing at that point, and the common thing is that you're accused of complicity in what is being said, and you're accused of endorsing what is being said. But actually what you are doing is you are defending the bigger principle of free speech. You know, uncontroversial speech does not require protection. That's the point. So it is hard, but the best way to do it is, of course, is firstly to make absolutely clear that you disapprove of what it is you are defending, but to defend it nonetheless. That's the test. I mean, when the Skokie, for instance, you remember the march in Skokie, Chicago, which was the famous march where the ACLU defended the right of neo-Nazis to march. And there was a book by a man called Neher. It was called Defending My Enemy. And this was a man who was a Holocaust survivor and came from a family of Holocaust survivors. And he says in the introduction to the book, you know, I defended the right of the Nazis to march because I wanted to defeat Nazis. In other words, he understood that you can't defeat these terrible ideas in society unless you stand up for the principle of free speech. It's impossible. The reason to defend free speech is not, as some people say, because people want an excuse to be racist. The reason is to be able to effectively challenge racism. You know, and this is such a fundamental misunderstanding. And I'm hoping that's what I'm trying to explain in the book. And obviously, I'm not doing a very good job of it now because it's a talk. That's why I had to write a book about it, because I felt it needed a more protracted discussion in order to explain this point.
Yeah, exactly. And the link to that obviously will be in the description. But Andrew, I wonder if then to bring proceedings to a close, I wonder if you might summarise why you reckon, and I don't wish to again put words in your mouth, but I assume this is your position, that we all actually need to. Do we all need to play our part a bit in being a bit braver in saying no to these people, in just saying no to those who don't wish our nation well? Like, for example, if a friend were to offer me friendly advice and say, well, Darren, I would do things a bit differently if I were you, I would listen to them. But were someone that I know absolutely despises every fibre of my being to say, well, Darren, I think you should do something different, I might be, you know, a little bit more reticent in listening to them. But in saying no as well to those who seek to divide us, in saying no to those who seek to undermine the fantastic progress that we've made over recent generations that you've mentioned, do we all have a role to play? If those could be your final remarks.
I think we all do need to be an awful lot braver. I think I'm always very wary when I say this, because I'm very much aware that it's easier for me insofar as I've never been censored. I've always said exactly what I want, and in fact, my career depends upon it. I don't have a boss who's going to fire me because of a joke I've told. So I am not in the firing line in that respect. the people who are really in the firing line are the people who have jobs that they depend on them. I mean, I lost a job. I ran a stand-up comedy course in a London theatre, and I lost that job because someone in the group claimed to feel unsafe because of a joke I tweeted on Twitter, right? And I lost that job as a result of that. Now, that's a typical tactic of cancel culture, by the way, because if you go to an employer and say, oh, I disagree with this person's opinion, the employer will say, well, what can I do about that? But if you say, there's a health and safety issue, I feel physically violated, I feel like there's a threat of violence, then actually they are obliged to do something about that. So that's just a misuse of language in order to achieve a political goal. The thing about cancel culture is it is often not about genuine breaches of contract at all. It is about people who have simply said opinions that other people don't like. But I lost that job, but I didn't depend upon that job. I was doing that job because I out of the passion for the subject. I was, you know, obviously I'm into stand-up comedy, and I enjoyed doing that, and also I felt a sense of loyalty to the theatre because I'd worked with them for so long, but I wasn't financially dependent on that. I had other sources of income, so it didn't matter to me that I lost that job, right? But for most people who get quote unquote cancelled, which of course is just a metaphor, people always go on about, oh, no one's been cancelled. Well, we're not talking about literal cancellation, are we? We're talking about this concept. They're not very good at metaphor, by the way, the social justice lot. They don't like it. They're very literal minded. That's why they think jokes are violent, because they don't understand the difference between a joke and a literal statement of fact, which makes it very difficult to enjoy comedy. But anyway, what I was saying was, if I worked in, you know, when I used to work at the call center, and that was my only source of income, and I got fired, that would make a massive difference. Yeah. Imagine if I had children. Imagine if I had dependents, and someone was going to, and someone heard or screenshot an opinion, totally legitimate. You know, we're not talking about neo-Nazi stuff. We're talking about just a totally legitimate legal opinion. Even that phrase, legal opinion, sends chills through my spine. But anyway, you know what I mean. And they went to the employer and they said, I feel unsafe because of this, and you lost your job. As a result, that has real world effects. So it's easy for me. Okay, so having got that caveat out of the way, I also think it is incumbent to think of the bigger picture. I think a lot more people will lose their jobs for taking a stand. I think when for instance, people decide that they will say what they think at work, and they will joke in the way that they, you know, you can't have a job without being able to joke, and the risk of potentially causing offense is always there in any human interaction, and especially so when you're making a joke. But if you can't have that, you're reduced to a life of drudgery where you're just a robot. You know, it's really important that we're able to, and that we're able to make mistakes, you know, that we're able to, you know, the response now, if someone, it's perfectly possible to write something online and you phrase it badly, or you say something that perhaps you didn't quite mean, right? But you should be able to make that mistake without having your life completely ruined as a result of it. And the way to, you know, the impulse now would be, of course, to screen grab it, post it online, publicly shame the person, initiate a pile-on, go to the employers and go at them until this person is fired. And I mean, what you should do in that situation is maybe contact the person privately and say, oh, this upset me for this reason. Can we have a conversation about it? That's how an adult behaves. The infantile, childish thing is to try and publicly shame and destroy them. And that also goes back to what we were talking about before, is the fun of it, the fun of destruction, the fun of being an activist, the delight, the very base delight that one takes in the crushing of an enemy. And that is an instinct that we all have, but it's an instinct very much to be resisted. I see that instinct very much in this movement. It's not an instinct that is very prominent within me, and that's why I'm always surprised when other people do it. But it also makes me think that the way in which these activists always assume ill intent, always assume that you have a vicious motive or a horrible. It makes me think that's probably because they do themselves. Because I never assume that of someone else, and it would strike me as strange to do so. And I think one of the big things about this is they do so because they know that, because that's part of who they are. Is that their instinct? That's why they're bullies. That's why they're so vicious and cruel. And yet they found a narrative, they found an ideology that allows them to be cruel, and yet to simultaneously believe that they are virtuous. So I think in the face of that, and because of the threat that it poses to free speech and our basic liberties and our basic human rights, it's too important an issue to be complacent. And even if it means that a lot of us will lose our jobs, and even if it means that we put ourselves at risk, we have to take a stand, because it will. By doing so, eventually there will be a tipping point. The analogy I've often used before, I don't mind using it again because I think it's absolutely right, is the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts, where the group of girls, as dramatized by Arthur Miller in The Crucible, but the group of girls, which was based on real, like this actually happened. These girls accused people of witchcraft, accused people of colluding with Satan. And whenever someone in the town said, "This is nonsense, the girls are making it up," the girls would then point at that person and say, "She's a witch," or "He's a witch," and then they would hang as well. So the risk was great. But that would have kept going and going and going. The only reason it stopped is because they reached a tipping point where there were too many people in the village of Salem saying, "No, we're not having this anymore." And when there's too many, it means it has to be called out. And in fact, in that case, it was because the governor's wife was accused. So there was a way in which they had a sense that they could legitimately do this. And perhaps the same will happen here, is that perhaps one of the victims of cancel culture will suddenly be one of their own, or it'll be someone who it's just inexcusable to cancel, and that will be the impulse. But yes, I do actually absolutely believe that for all the potential for utterly ruinous consequences, we have to work together on this and push back against it.
And the best way to do that, of course, is to buy your book, which is out on February.
Wow.
What was it? February 25th, was it?
You know what? You said it, not me. I wouldn't be that cynical. Yeah, February the 25th.
Yeah. No, I would urge to, because you are, as I said at the start, I don't mean I'm lurching back into sycophancy, but I really do think you are fantastic at communicating why all these ideas are so important. And maybe it's because, you're not on the right like I am, and you are able to sort of say, well, actually, I'm one of you guys. And they might say, well, I don't believe you. Yeah.
Left-wing people hate, more than anything, they hate turncoats. So they I think they probably hate me more because I've ostensibly come from that side, But there we go. I mean,
yeah, Sodom. That's what I say. I think you're fantastic, really. and I'll link to that in the description. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Now, I'm sure you'll be absolutely desperate to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, and I will see you next time. Reasoned relies upon grassroots donations from people like yourself that want us to continue producing our high quality, free thinking content. So please do consider clicking the link and donating, no matter how big, no matter how small, because it really does ensure that we can keep on keeping on.